Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Merjani Rawls. We're talking all about the Bachman books today, and this collection includes, well, it used to include 4 stories, which were Rage, The Long Walk, Roadwork, and The Running Man. However, newer editions do not include Rage, and I touched on that briefly in the thinner episode I did with Mike Comite, and it was a decision that Stephen King did have a part in. It wasn't something where it was just banned completely because of its content, with it being about a school shooting and all that came with that in that story. So it actually was a mutual decision, which I think is important to note, because it's not like Stephen King was just banned from publishing one of his stories. It was something that he agreed to take out of print. And so if you buy newer versions of the Bachman books, it will not contain Rage, or you could just go buy the 3 stories individually, if I'm not mistaken. But Merjani, did you have a chance to get the copy that also had Rage in it?
I had to track down Rage separately.
Okay.
Like the one I found in the library didn't have Rage in it, so I just had to like find the story somewhere and just read it.
Yeah, it's hard to find.
Yeah, like I asked the library, they're like, no, we don't have it. So
They were probably like, yeah, we don't want to have that. In my case, my mom had bought the original paperback copy, so she had one of the 80s copies. So, the collection came out in October of 1985. So my mom must have bought either that first edition for the paperback or one shortly thereafter if it was reprinted. I'm not exactly sure. I didn't look at the copyright date in, or the publishing date in the book, but they did release a later edition in 1996, and I'm not totally clear on if that included Rage still, but it included a different introduction titled The Importance of Being Bachman. So that is possibly the one I had. I'm not really sure. I read it. It had Rage in it. That's all that matters. But I think we can go ahead and dive into that story, which, doesn't have too many likable characters. And that's something I think kind of ran throughout these 4 early novels. And, it is important to note that while this was published in 1985, many of these stories were written in the 70s, or at least started in the 70s and then later finished. So each one was, something that Stephen King maybe started in high school or college, around that age. And you can tell, I think, and with Rage, it's a story that centers around Charlie Decker, who is a senior in high school, and he just decides that he is going to bring a gun to school because he's sort of this outsider, and he ends up shooting, I want to say, at least 2 people. And it is a situation where he basically holds an entire classroom hostage, kind of, sort of, but not really. And it was just a very strange read, in my opinion.
well, given what's happened since then,
Yeah,
like Columbine and like all these school shootings that kind of like reference from it, like the one in Kentucky where like the guy had a copy of Rage.
right. And I think that's what led Stephen King to opt to take it out of print, because it was something that they had found, I think, not only in one school shooter's backpack, but more than one. So it was a story that clearly had some sort of impact on these kids. Whether or not it actually determined what they did is a whole other thing. They could have easily acted the same way without having read the story, but it is something that treats a school shooting as not a big deal. It was very strange how he wrote the characters in this, because very few of the students have what would seem to be the usual reaction to a kid walking into a classroom with a gun and shooting people. So you have these high school kids who then just end up almost being as sort of twisted as the story itself. And you would think that would be something that he would keep just as the main character, the school shooter. This is a kid who clearly needs some help, but then by the end of the story, I was like, I think a lot of these kids need help, and it's not necessarily just because, Charlie walked in and shot a couple people. It seemed like they had all of this stuff pent up inside of them, and Charlie doing what he did is what allowed them to get that all out in the world, or in that classroom at least. And it just seemed very odd. It's not necessarily that it was a bad story. Like, I don't really think any of these were super poorly written or anything like that. It's just some stories need to have likable characters, and this really wasn't one of them. Even, the principal, the teachers, no one was really likable, and I think that was sort of a big downside for it.
Yeah, I think like the only character that was somewhat likable was Ted Jones.
Yeah, the person you would not expect to be likable.
Yeah, like the popular guy, and then the students beat the hell out of him.
Yeah.
So
He's the only one you really feel bad for at the end, I think, aside from, the victims. It's like, okay, yeah, I don't really feel bad for most of these high school kids except for Ted Jones. It's a very odd feeling when you're done reading this. You're like, I don't feel right now.
yeah, like because Charlie kills the algebra teacher, and then he kills the history teacher, and then like sets his locker on fire. But like there's like this it's almost like an experiment, like where he locks them up and they all start telling like embarrassing all like secrets about themselves and other people. And I don't know if that was set up to like make it seem where like everybody has secrets and everybody is evil, but I'm like, yo, like this kid literally like shot like uh teachers to death and whatnot. And like I don't, it's weird because like I don't know what Stephen King was kind of doing there. Like am I supposed to sympathize with Charlie because he had his father was abusive? Like it kind of has like the parallels to like the news now, like when stuff happens this way and you find out that like kids, like there's a school shooting happens and then it comes out like their background. Either, he was so great. I would have never thought that he would have done this, or like he was bullied in school. Like, well, no, he still killed people. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it was weird where Stephen King was kind of trying to pull me when I was reading. I'm like, I'm not really supposed to feel sympathy for him. And then like this mob mentality when they basically beat the hell out of Ted, where he's just like in a coma or whatever. He couldn't leave or whatnot. And then the story ends just, he's found not guilty because he's insane, and then he's just in like a psychiatric hospital for the rest of his life, I guess. And then the story just kind of ends. And I'm like, oh, all right.
Yeah.
There's no really sense of justice, you know?
No, not at all. And it was one of those things where, because we have seen this happen in the news, you mentioned Columbine, and there was actually just another school shooting in Colorado, like a few weeks ago, if that. And you have, Sandy Hook, all of these things are happening. And even though Sandy Hook was not, someone who attended the school committing the shooting, it still has this same effect. Like, who would do something like that? And you don't really feel bad even when you do, like you said, find out about Charlie's background. And I don't know if it was ever Stephen King's intent to make you feel bad for the shooter necessarily. I think it was more a commentary on, hey, these high school kids have all of this stuff building up inside of them, and let's throw them in a school shooting scenario and see how they handle it. And none of it felt realistic, really, except for when Ted Jones kept trying to do the right thing. And then you have the girl who freaks out, and he eventually lets her go to the bathroom, and she comes back. I was like, why? She could have easily just gone outside and not had to deal with any of it, but she comes back, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. Something just felt off about it the whole time, and it wasn't great. I mean, I think stories about school shootings are not meant to be great at the same time either, but there was just something that was a disconnect for me with this story. And I'm sure, there have been plenty of books on Columbine and Sandy Hook and, the Virginia Tech shooting, all of these horrible things that have happened. And because those are true stories, I think that's something where you can really get a sense for how people felt in those moments. But with this fictional story, it's like, yeah, I think it went a little too far in sort of twisting how things would have actually played out.
Well, it feels like, especially the kids, had like a huge thing of Stockholm syndrome, where like with Stockholm syndrome, like there's like where and this has happened with like bank robberies and stuff like that, like where the captors feel like almost sympathetic to the assailant, and that's what happened here with with Ted Jones and why they like brutally beat him and whatnot. But like I don't know, like it's I think in another way, especially with copycats and whatnot, I feel that it kind of gives that commentary too. Not to say that like the kids in this particular classroom would have went out and like shot students as well. I mean, or shot students or teachers as well. But like, it's interesting to see that like what Charlie does and like holds them hostage. They kind of like almost turn into quasi Charlies themselves because of all their angst and the fact that like he like with the flashbacks you see the abuse and it's almost like Stephen King is like you said we're all these kids have this angst and anger and whatnot, and I think that's what he was trying to go for. But at the same time, like I don't know if you really do that with sympathizing with like a murderer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Well, shall we move on to The Long Walk now?
Sure.
I think of the four stories, this might have been the one I liked the most, even though there are still plenty of unlikable characters in it, because you have one, like Rage, you have quite a few characters in this, It's really, this grim story, though. So basically, all of these guys go on this long walk and they're selected seemingly at random, and then you just walk until you can't walk anymore, and then if you can't walk anymore you're killed. So it's like, okay, yeah, we better just keep walking, and obviously at some point everyone's going to stop walking. It's sort of a last man standing kind of thing, and you have this sort of shadowy figure the whole time called the Major, and his presence is felt even when he's not there. He does pop up every now and then, but there are just so many weird things about this story too. It's like, okay, this is not a future United States I would want to live in, and this isn't the only one of the four stories that take place in the future. We'll get to that more with The Running Man later too, but what were your initial thoughts on The Long Walk?
I think that with all these adaptations that they're doing with Stephen King novels, I'm surprised that they haven't done this yet.
I wonder if they might feel like it would be too boring just watching people walk and walk and walk and walk. I think if done right, it could turn out really well, because you have sort of these little groups that you see along the way. And there's a lot of character work in this one that I think would play really well on screen. But it's one of those things where I think it would be a very, very fine line of an adaptation of this being really good and being a train wreck.
Yeah, you would have to do it since it really kind of takes place on this walk. You would have to. I feel like you would have to do it kind of like on the walk and somewhat flashback-ish to kind of like give like an overall like view of it.
Yeah, like some context of the
Yeah,
main character, Ray Garrity, hanging out with his girlfriend or something like that, just so it sort of breaks up the mundane walk. There isn't a whole lot happening until someone gets shot, basically, because they have to keep walking. They can go to the bathroom, but they get warnings, and if they don't hurry up, they get shot. So, and you don't really want to see someone taking a dump on screen. So, there are some aspects of the story where I think, like you said, a flashback would work well to just sort of bolster the backstory of these characters and how they were before the walk, because, you get a lot of stories being told throughout this, because what else are they going to do? Just not talk to each other, not tell each other about their lives and everything like that. And you have at least, 5 or 6 main characters. I already mentioned Ray Garrity. You also have Peter McVries, Art Baker, Hank Olson, Gary Barkovich, and Stebbins, who is an illegitimate son of the Major. And that's something that comes up, and you could have an interesting moment with them too. But I think, as far as the story itself goes, you have some homophobic characters in this, and that's something that you read it and you kind of cringe reading it, because you're like, oh, this is so very of its time. And you're like, okay, not great, but there's a lot of other things going on as well. And I think those moments were few and far between. It's not like the whole story of these guys revolved around, okay, this guy is homophobic or anything like that. It was just these brief moments where it kind of took me out of the story, because I was like, oh, all right. Especially since it was supposed to take place in the future. I thought that was a little odd, although, those people still exist today too. It's just not pleasant to read about still.
A lot of this and how the walk was set up kind of reminded me of the Hunger Games a little bit.
Admittedly, I have not read or watched those, so I do know the gist of the story though. So, I like that comparison.
Yeah, like how they could only get, they only have like new food supplies at like 9 in the morning. You could request like a fresh canteen every time, and then you could only get it from the soldiers and whatnot. Like, you could have like bodily contact as long as you stayed on the road, and then there's like warnings that you get, and essentially buying the ticket means that you're gonna get killed.
Yeah, and you get, I believe, 3 warnings, and then it's kind of like 3 strikes, and then you're out.
And then you're out. Even though in the story, like, they do get 3 warnings, but none of them die.
They come very close, I think, though.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they get super close to dying. I don't know, like, Stebbins was interesting to me because he's like like I said, like, he's the illegitimate son of the Major, but he's also the rabbit. And if if you've run races, like, or if you, like, run distance, like, the rabbit is the person that, like, you basically, like, run your pace off of. And it's weird to me, at least, like, he's like the extension of his father in encouraging the other boys to keep going on the long walk, which is weird because he is like second to last. He dies before Garrity does. But I found that interesting. Hank Olson's a jerk, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I find it there's like that sports comparison. Like, he basically like talked trash and got people in trouble that way. He dies in a really, really gruesome way, which I wasn't expecting. I think like his intestines spill out of his stomach.
Yeah, because he takes a shot to the stomach, and then they just start sort of falling out, and he keeps going. He doesn't stay down right away, and then he starts screaming, and it is this brutal scene. And I think the reason this was one of the better stories out of this for me was because of the character work. And even if you don't like all of the characters, at least some of them are a little likable. You have Peter McVries, who is cynical, but at the same time, he sort of sticks together with Garrity, and they kind of just keep each other going. So, you have people building these friendships along the way. It was not quite like reading The Stand, because I think that is sort of just an excellent example of character work for a lot of those characters. But I sort of got that same journeyman feeling reading this that I did when I was reading The Stand, or even The Dark Tower of the Gunslinger, because he does a lot of walking in that book. And, Stephen King likes it when people have to travel, either by foot or some other way. And I think it really opens up the opportunity to get to know the characters, because it's something that is so boring to do. It's not exciting to just read a story where someone is walking the entire time unless you put in that character work. This could have been a total disaster if he hadn't done that.
Yeah, I feel like, and this is a grueling walk. I feel like everybody comes undone in their own way. Like even with, Garrity, like who wins or whatnot, he doesn't stop. He actually like hallucinates and keeps on going. So it really just goes to show you, like, first of all, like, I don't think any of us would want to live in this in this future or whatnot.
No,
Like, if we
not at
had to
all.
do this, uh, but like, yeah, like I love how like it affected, Peter, who's like the muscly guy, uh, who gets killed by the soldiers or whatnot, like Stevens and Art Baker and whatnot, like, where like Garrity kind of like reacts to his death and whatnot. Like it affects each thing that happens to somebody else. Like it's not only a physical thing. I like that it was the walk was more of a mental thing too, because like it, in sports, it's kind of like there's a trade off of like physicality and there's also a mentality to it. And I like how like Stephen King kind of like did both of these.
Yeah, it's just really nice to sort of get that juxtaposition with all of these characters too. They're going through the same exact thing, but they're all handling it different
Different.
ways. Gary Barkovich is a total jerk to everyone. He's telling people he's going to dance on their graves, and then, some of the other guys hear a shot fired, and one asks if it was him, and the guy hears him and screams, "Not yet." And then, he just rips his own throat out. So,
Yeah.
that guy is like on a whole other level, and you can tell throughout the entire story once he's brought into it. It's like, yeah, let's stay away from that guy because something is off with him. And you just get this look at these characters that I really think you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. And it'll be interesting to see if this ends up being adapted in the flurry of adaptations that have been coming so far.
Yeah, I think, like you said, like if they find a way to do it where it's not, where it doesn't get just the walk, because like you said, like I think if they just did the walk, it would just be like, oh, like one setting.
It
But
would
if
be
they
a
could,
20-minute short.
yeah, it would be a short film. So like if they find a way, if they found a way to really do it, I think they could kind of pull it off.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move on to Road Work, which is another one I wasn't too fond of. You know, this dude and his guns and explosives. I mean, like, I don't even really know if I have too terribly much to say about this, because, we meet this character. He's not exactly down on his luck. He sort of just chooses not to do something, and it basically ruins his life. He could have just done what he was supposed to do at work and things would have been fine. But he is sort of becoming this anti corporation guy, and he's upset because he needs to move out of his house and buy a new one because the land has been bought up and something else is going to be built there. And that's something that's understandable, but when you then factor in the fact that he was offered a fair price for the house, he had a steady job and chose to blow it because he didn't want to find a new factory for them to work at or whatever, a new location for them. It's kind of hard to feel bad for this guy. And he cheats on his wife later. So, really not great qualities.
He cheats on his wife. He uh, gets all these guns. Later in the story, blows up the damn house. Like I don't know. And like reading about it and like what Stephen King said, like it was kind of an extension of working through like his mother's death by cancer and whatnot. And I think in the story, you find out that the character's son, the daughter's son, like dies from brain cancer.
Right.
So like he basically has an emotional attachment to the house.
Yeah, and I think the son's death is really the only reason one would sympathize with the character
Yeah.
because that's something that obviously impacted both him and his wife. And, it's understandable, but a lot of his present day situation is simply of his own doing. So then you factor that in, and it's like, I wanted to feel bad for you, but now I find it really hard to feel bad for you. And, that's kind of what I meant by a lot of the characters weren't really too likable in some of these stories. Obviously The Long Walk had some, but this one, it centers around Dawes, Bart and George Dawes to be exact. And you're just like, okay, this is a guy who clearly needed help and it didn't really seem like he got that help. And he tried to just move on from what had happened. And he ultimately was not able to do that. So then he dug himself into an even deeper hole. And like you said, literally just blows up his house with him inside of it.
Well, it's weird because, you know, they're like basically like demolishing this house in the neighborhood because they want to build this like highway extension. But you find out at the end of the story that they didn't even have to build it. Like
Yeah.
there was no real reason for it. So I felt like, okay, so
They didn't want their funding to get cut was the reason they did that. And it is something where you're like, oh man, all of that and it was for nothing.
yeah, I'm like, okay, so like how am I sympathizing with him here? Because the thing that he was rallying against didn't even need to happen. Like it was just like pseudo greed, I guess. But like on the way there, like him, him getting explosives and like him refusing the money and then him having like, like that affair with that hitchhiker and whatnot. I'm like, all right, like is this all like I get like he has an attachment to the house, but like is all this really necessary, man? Like to like go and like flail against I don't know, like I understand like maybe it's showing like what grief does and makes us unreasonable and stuff like that. But a lot of it, like you said, seemed really excessive. Like I'm like, dude, just you know what I mean? Like just take the money and build an even bigger house. You know what I mean? But sometimes things are priceless. I don't know.
Yeah, I get that. I think the whole, losing his job thing was more on him than
Oh
anything
yeah.
else because that was something that was totally unnecessary because he thought since his life was being uprooted, he just wouldn't do his job. And he screwed so many people over in the process because basically everyone who worked there was out of a job because he didn't do his job. And that's something that is not really forgivable. And then he has the balls to go up to one of the coworkers and be like, dude, you need to get out of this job that they found for you because it's a dead end. You shouldn't do this. And the guy's kind of like, dude, this is all your fault. So, screw you. And he punches him in the face. And you're like, yeah, I don't really feel bad for him at that moment either because he walked right into that, literally.
Yeah. Like I'm like, wow, so like I understand this happened to you. I understand that you were going through circumstances here, whatnot, but like, boy, you turned into a real asshole, like costing people jobs. Like,
Yeah, you can't just go around ruining other people's lives and expect them to be okay with it and then tell them what to do afterwards when you don't like what they're doing. Like, that's not how it works.
yeah, I can't.
It's hard.
Like you said, like I didn't like. At first, I was like, okay, like I get it, but like the steps that he was taking, like he basically became Rambo, and I was like, against who? Like the I guess like construction people, whatnot. Like I don't like, or like the city's attorney. Like, are you gonna shoot them all? It's just yeah, it was just weird. You know, like
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I was with you. I was very iffy on the story.
Yeah. Well, the final story, The Running Man, is one that I think had a lot of potential with what it was trying to do. This is another one that was set in the future, and there's this crazy game show sort of thing, and it's very weird. And I know you mentioned that the movie adaptation was not really anything like the
Oh, it's
story.
completely,
So
yeah, it's completely different.
yeah, so I haven't seen that, but now I'm very interested in, seeing what the differences are because I've seen, that Arnold Schwarzenegger is in the movie and that's about it. That's my extent. And I knew it was sort of this futuristic thing, but, there's this place called Co-op City, and that is where Ben Richards lives. He's the main protagonist in this, and he ends up, you know, going to the Games Federation, which is a government mandated television station. And they have these violent game shows that people watch on a TV monitor called a freebie. And it's very Big Brother like. I got some 1984 vibes with this one.
Yeah,
And you can sort of get this feeling that, none of this is going to end well. And it kind of does, but doesn't. And eventually, a lot of the characters in this weren't entirely likable either. It's like, oh, okay, that's what you're going to do, and that is okay by you. I mean, I guess, sure, whatever.
yeah, it's weird because like I was texting you when after I read it, I'm like, this is not. It's definitely not the movie. If anybody who's seen the movie, the game show is still there, but you have Arnold Schwarzenegger and he gets framed for something, and like it's literal like a game show, as in like uh, people bet, whoever, because they have the hunters in there, but it's very game show. Like the hunters have, personalities. Like one is Fireball, so he has flamethrowers and whatnot, and then
Okay, so
you
it's
have
like
like
there's specific kind of hunters in the
yeah, yeah,
movie, whereas in this, they're kind of just like random dudes, and you don't really know anything about them. They're kind of these shadowy figures, and
they're like SWAT.
yeah, it was very, very weird. And, sometimes the whole dystopia thing works and sometimes it doesn't. But I feel like in this, the idea of the dystopia definitely works well. It's one of those things where you think you're going to like the main character, but then, as he does more and more things to get away, basically, you're kind of like, I understand you are running for your life, but, I don't think you're going about this the best way. He's carjacking people, threatening a lady, and by the end of it, when he is with the lady he carjacks, you can't really tell what he's going to do because he is very, very close to the end of his rope. And you can tell just by everything else that's going on in the story that, this is not going to end well. And he takes her hostage, and even if he doesn't intend to hurt her, it's like you still took somebody hostage, and that's not okay.
Well, the reason that he's doing this anyway because his daughter needs medicine, and his wife is unfortunately is a prostitute. So
Right.
he's doing this to get money for it, and nobody's ever won the grand prize of $1 billion. So while he's doing all this bad shit, Killian kills his family anyway.
Yeah.
He killed not only does he kill them, he kills them what 10 days earlier before he goes on the show. So I'm like, oh wow, and that was like a horror twist. Which I mean, hey, it's Stephen King, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like you want to sympathize with the character at the beginning, and then you just have this horrible situation that's revealed to you at the end, and you're like, okay, so again, this was something that was all for nothing. Like road work, it's like
Yeah,
all
it
of
was.
this for nothing. And I guess, he probably should have known what was going to happen. And I understand that he probably didn't care what happened to him as long as the daughter got the medicine. But
Hmm.
given how shady these people were, I don't know what led him to believe that they would keep their end of any sort of deal, because he is going through this whole process and he asks to see his wife multiple times before he's even actually being hunted. And they just keep putting him off. And he doesn't really seem to think that's weird. So it's like, okay, what is really going on here? Because I think, as you're reading this, you can tell that something is off from the beginning. And I think maybe it's just the fact that it's a dystopia where the government runs, these
everything.
violent game shows. So, it's very, very strange. And when he was running on the treadmill, at first I was like, please tell me this guy isn't going to be running on a treadmill the entire story, because that would not be fun. So it at least raised the stakes. And, Ben Richards is still likable in a sense, but, like we've said, he has to do a lot of bad stuff. And in the end, it's for no reason. So by the end of this, you sort of feel depleted yourself. You're like, oh, okay, that's what happened.
But like even how the game is set up, like viewers like can tell where Ben is and get cash prizes.
Yeah.
So it was like, all right, well it's just set up for him to lose anyway.
Right.
And then he meets Bradley, and then like he tells him about like the network, and then the network dubs over what he says anyway. It's like, well, he's not going to win. Like obviously the network or the government has all their bases covered. And then you find out at the end, like, you know what I mean? It was really all for nothing anyway. And he just like kind of like it's a sad poetic thing of like sacrificing himself.
Yeah.
Because he like crashes. He lets Amelia jump off, which is great. He kills McCone, and then he like crashes the plane into the headquarters, and he kills Killian anyway. But yeah, like there was no point in this story when I was reading it that I was like, he's not going to win. Like there's just too many roadblocks and caveats that for him to overcome, like.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It was definitely a story that had potential, and I think it just didn't quite hit the way I was hoping it would. But do you have any last thoughts on this one before we sort of go into some overall final thoughts about the collection?
No, I think we pretty much summed it up. Like I would say I liked the story more than I liked a couple of these.
Yeah.
Like I probably more than Rage, definitely. Yeah, there was definitely like potential there. It was definitely interesting, like reading the book adaptation from seeing the movie when I was younger and it being different. And this one is a little bit more grim. Actually, it's a lot more grim, but yeah, like it was interesting. And I think it's interesting that Stephen King kind of 2 out of the 4 stories, he went into like this futuristic, like,
dystopia.
1984 dystopia. Like, I'm like, wow, what did he think of the future?
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me, if I had to rank these stories from, best to worst, in my opinion, I would go with The Long Walk, The Running Man, Rage, and then Roadwork. And I think, Rage and Roadwork are kind of tied for me. I don't know. Overall, I gave this collection 2 out of 5. It was just one of those things where after I read this, I was like, wow, I need some time, It's one of those things where you just read so much
dread
of this. Yeah, you just read about so much dread that it was like, oh man, this kind of took a toll. And, when you include Rage in this, it's over 900 pages of story. So that's a lot of grim. And I'm reading it now, as I know you are too. And it's just like, wow, that's a lot back to back. That's a lot to take in. And yeah, I don't know. I gave it a 2 out of 5 initially. I might change that. But overall, I think even though I did like The Long Walk and The Running Man better, there were still aspects to the story that I wasn't really fond of. And, some of the language used in, these 80s stories, or in the case of the Bachman books, some are from the 70s, like I mentioned. And you kind of just cringe while reading some of it because you're like, ooh, this part did not age well at all. And, I'm very aware that that is going to happen a lot. And I think it's something we're going to discuss in it as well, because you're coming back for that one. And there's just so many things in that you're like, I don't really want to read this, but here we go.
Oh boy, there's a yeah.
We
We
can
got to
get to that
record that. We got to
later.
record that next week, and there's a particular part in it where, well, yeah, we'll get to yeah. That's going to be a whole other can of worms to get to. Good Lord. Yeah, like it was tough, especially starting with Rage and what was going on right now, and the fact that like I saw what he was trying to go for, but if you read it and you aren't really kind of like thinking kind of like what we are doing right now,
hmm
it seems super sympathetic to the evil person. I'm like, whoa, 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 like, you know what I mean? Like, there's
Yeah,
supposed to
you're
be
like,
like,
no, no, thank you.
yeah, there's supposed to be like a lesson here not to do that. And like you said, like reading Rage and kind of Running Man and The Long Walk, and there's no there's really no happy endings to these books. And the fact that he felt so kind of like bogged down about the future, especially with The Long Walk and The Running Man, and basically saying that like, our entertainment is gonna be of amusement and like basically like kill people and whatnot. I was like, oh man, like it was. I was like, whew. When I was done reading the Bachman books, I'm like, damn, like he was going through a real dark period here.
Yeah, it definitely was. And because, again, these were early works, I think maybe he was sort of just playing around with a few different ideas, and not all of his collections, especially more of the short story collections, really have this central theme. But I think with these four Bachman novels, it felt a little like reading different seasons, which had four novellas in it, because
Yeah.
there was a lot of character work done in different seasons that worked really well. And, I really enjoyed 3 out of 4 of those stories. Whereas with this one, I didn't like it nearly as much, but at the same time, you could see where a lot of that character work was stemming from, especially with it being his early work. So I think this was something where it was like a stepping stone for him. And I'm kind
Hmm.
of glad I ended up talking about the collection as a whole instead of separating them out because, like I mentioned when I started this, it's mostly chronological, the order I'm going in. But in the case of this, because one of the novels, Rage, came out in, I believe, 1977, that would have been one of the first few episodes. And
Hmm.
I don't know if I would have wanted to talk about Rage as one of the first few episodes. I think it was sort of nice to have the context of his other early work and then sort of come to this and be like, okay, I can really see where some of that stuff came from without having to talk about such a downer subject so early on in the podcast.
No, I agree. I think if we like tackle these separately, like as in one, like Rage is just such a oof, like that's just especially like to listen to, and like I know when you write here, it's like how it's like 211 pages of just kind of like this like rabbit hole of just I wouldn't say evil, but like it gets really dark. So I think that while all these books are dark, I think that like when I went to going to Rage and then reading, The Long Walk, it kind of like brought it up a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
then and then the Running Man kind of like, all right, you know what I mean? And Roadwork, I was just like, why, man? So like Roadwork kind of like leveled it out for me. I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you like seriously, dude? Like, why are you doing this? So yeah, I definitely agree with you.
Yeah, I'm actually glad that I haven't liked everything necessarily that Stephen King has done up to this point. I mean, obviously, I've enjoyed a lot of it and I'm enjoying the whole process of reading this, but I would say this is probably the book I've liked the least out of everything I've read. And when I say the book, I sort of mean the whole collection, not just, one in particular. But I think it was just something that took so much out of me to read. I was like, okay, got to get back to Bachman Books. And, when a book feels like a chore to read, I think that's a pretty good sign of, maybe this isn't for me. And if there are people out there who really enjoy these stories, that's cool. They just weren't for me. And, they had horrific things happening, but they didn't really have some of those horror elements that I really enjoy in Stephen King stories. And, the Different Seasons collection was the same way, but I feel like the character work was just so much better in those stories for the most part that I liked those better, even though they didn't have, all of these horror elements. And I know Stephen King has done things like, there's the Mr. Mercedes trilogy that I will eventually get to in like a couple of years here on the podcast. It's just one of those things where I'm actually kind of glad that it's not like this podcast is going to be me just singing Stephen King's praises the entire time, because I was not as much of a fan of this one, but it was still really great discussing it with you, Mirjani.
Yeah. I mean, like, we kind of do that, with some of the movie podcasts. Like, Stephen King is one of my, Stephen King is one of my favorite authors too. But like, I don't love everything that he does, and I think that's healthy. I think that you can have a favorite, or you can have a favorite movie and whatnot, and still not like aspects of it, and that being totally okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this collection. I know it was a long one, and as I mentioned, you'll be back for It, which is even longer. So, I think we'll have to carve out like an extra amount of time for that one, because so much just goes on in it.
There's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up this episode. So to our listeners, you can follow the podcast at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. It would be awesome if you could rate or review the podcast if you have a moment. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
See you.